Unfortunately, life isn't always a bowl of cherries. Disasters happen in the world, and today we're going to help you talk about them in English. Welcome to episode 184 of
Aprender Inglés con Reza y Craig.
Hello and welcome. My name's Craig.
My name's Reza.
And if you are a new listener, Reza and I, with over 45 years of teaching experience between us, are going to help you improve your English and take it to the next level. How are you doing, Reza?
I'm very well, Craig. What about you? How are things?
Yep, pretty good. Reza, have we got any feedback this week?
Yes, we have an email from Veronica from Mexico. She says, "This is Veronica Morfin. It is nice to get to listen to your podcast. I don't dare to record a voice message now."
What does dare mean?
Dare means that if you dare to do something, that means you're brave enough to do it.
Mm-hmm.
You aren't frightened to do it.
So she doesn't really feel that she's confident enough to do a voice message.
No, but eventually I'll do it, she says. So she doesn't dare now, but when she gets that confidence, she will do it in the future. Well, we look forward to that, Veronica.
Yeah.
Anyway, 1 week ago, I came across your podcast when I was desperately looking for something to help me to improve my listening skills. I did the CAE, the CAE exam, the advanced exam, and I failed the listening section.
Oh, what a shame.
Pity. So here I am happily listening to, I think she forgot to say the two, we've added it for you, listening to your humorous way. That's fantastic. Please say hi to Reza, or hi Veronica, and to all your podcast listeners from Mexico.
Well, I've actually got some wonderful news because Veronica did dare to record a voice message and she sent it in to us very recently. So let's listen to Veronica now from Mexico.
Hello, Craig and Reza. This is Veronica from Mexico. I hope that my message is not too noisy. It's just a test because I do not have a microphone, but I am recording just with the iPad. I really like your podcast. It's been 3 weeks now that I am listening to your podcast, and I really like it. Thank you.
Well, that's fantastic, Veronica. Well done. We're really, really pleased that you sent us a voice message and we heard your voice. Reza, any comments?
Wow, your first ever voice message for us. Extremely clear and good pronunciation.
Yeah. Very,
very good. Craig, though, did you notice any perhaps grammar error that we could look at?
I didn't. Did you?
I did. Maybe I'm being a bit fussy because, Veronica, we understood you perfectly.
What does fussy mean?
Fussy is tickismickis, very particular.
Especial.
Especial. Yeah. Fussy, like I'm being a bit hard. I'm being a bit difficult to please.
Strict.
You said something like, it's 3 weeks since I'm listening, I think. Something like that. But you should have said, I have been listening for 3 weeks. Because if it's from the past up to now, it's got to be present perfect and continuous in this case. Have been plus ing. So you have been listening to us for 3 weeks. Well, thanks very much. Thanks for listening to us.
And I'd just like to say to anyone listening who has sent emails to us and hasn't yet sent a voice message, just use Veronica as an example of somebody who dared to do it. She spoke English. She sent us a voice message. And I just think that's fantastic. So we'd love you to try that and send us a message so that we can hear your English and help you improve it. And you don't need a microphone, as Veronica showed us. You can record it on your phone. You can go to the website inglespodcast.com. There's an app on the homepage called SpeakPipe. We speak about it a lot. Just click record your message and send it to us from your phone or from your laptop or desktop. And we really look forward to getting your voice messages and getting to know you better. I'm very sad to hear that Veronica didn't pass the CAE listening. If you are practicing for the CAE exam or FCE or proficiency, the websites that we've recommended in the past, just to remind you, there's examenglish.com. That's one webpage that has exam listenings, and I'll put the link to that and the others in the show notes to this episode at inglespodcast.com/184. So examenglish.com is a good website for practicing for the exam and for the listening. There's another one that we've recommended called flojo.com, FLO-JOE.com. That practices other parts of the exam, but not the listening. And I recently found another website that looks quite good for practicing FCE and CAE. It's called virtuaule.com, virtuaule.com. Has some very good listenings specifically for exam practice. All of those links in the show notes.
But of course, as Veronica has proven from her nice voice message, which is very clear, listening to podcasts is also good listening practice for exams, because any listening to authentic English will help you in your listening exam.
Absolutely.
So another person from Mexico, this time Anna, she suggested that we speak about natural disasters. Well, first of all, we'd like to say we're very sorry to hear the terrible news recently about the earthquake in Mexico. And we hope none of our listeners have been affected by that. It was a terrible, terrible disaster. Yeah. I think hundreds of people were killed and injured. Mm-hmm. So, as Craig said earlier, these things really do happen in real life, and Mexicans know that better than most people. We're very sorry to hear that, but we have to talk about these things. There's useful vocabulary to be learned. We spoke a little bit about weather, which is related to natural disasters, way back in episode 99. So if you go to inglespodcast.com/99, you'll find some vocabulary on weather. But we're going to talk about other things to do with natural disasters today.
Yes, before we do that, though, let's listen to Anna's voice message. So here's Anna from Mexico suggesting this week's topic on natural disasters.
Hi, Craig. Hi, Reza. I'm Anna from Mexico. This is my first time sending a voice message because I'm very shy. But that finished. Have you ever speak about natural disasters? I think it's a good topic. So it's all. My recommendation is speak about natural disasters because I felt the horrible earthquake in Mexico and it was a horrible experience. So thank you very much for everything and take care. Bye bye.
Well, first of all, it sounds as though Anna was affected by the earthquake. So that obviously is, we don't know what to say. That's really, really sad. And I hope that you and your family are okay. Reza, any comments on Anna's message?
Yes, you're right, Anna. It is a very interesting topic. Your message was really good. Your pronunciation was fantastic. And really very, very clearly pronounced vowels, consonants, intonation, stress. Brilliant.
And like Veronica, Anna also maybe feels a little shy, but both of those people have got on the microphone, sent us a voice message. So I think well done to both of you for taking the first step into improving your English. You did say, Anna, have you ever speak? You need the third form. So have you ever spoken? Have you ever spoken about? So something I got from Wikipedia in earlier this year, Mexico obviously suffered an earthquake that was centered around the states of Puebla and Morelos. And more than 40 buildings collapsed, according to Wikipedia. Many of those buildings in Mexico City. and 370 people lost their lives. Also, there was a very big earthquake back in 1985 where around 10,000 people lost their lives, according to Wikipedia. So Mexico is a very seismically active place on Earth. Reza, have you heard of a group of volunteers called the Moles? They were very much in the news recently.
No? Who are they?
The Moles, M-O-L-E-S, Los Topos. It's a group of volunteers who were actually formed in 1985 after that huge earthquake and that disaster. And they do incredible work taking people out of collapsed buildings, saving lives, helping the emergency services and the ambulances, getting people medical aid, searching and finding people who are under rubble. Rubble is the bricks and the plaster and everything that falls down after an earthquake or a disaster, the rubble. So they find people and save their lives. A fantastic group of volunteers who risk their lives to save others.
Yes, indeed. Craig, shall we talk about useful vocabulary to describe the different types of natural disasters? So we've started off by talking about earthquakes, tremors, if you like, tremor in Spanish. There is the word tremor in English, but we normally say earthquake. Seismic activity, when the ground shakes because of fault lines, those fallos, I think they're called in Spanish. And as Craig says, it can be measured, the seismic activity can be measured, and Mexico is very active on the Richter scale, the scale where they measure the Earth's movement from 1 to 10.
Yeah, I know if you get past, I think it's about 6 on the Richter scale, that's where things start to get very bad and very dangerous. Usually when I hear that it's a 6 or 7 and 8 or higher, then that's when buildings can fall and it's really life-threatening when it's past 6 on the Richter scale.
And moving on to another type of disaster where you think more than land, you think about water, or maybe land and water, and that's tsunamis. T-S-U-N-A-M-I, strange spelling.
Do you remember when, before tsunami got into common vocabulary, didn't it used to be called a tidal wave? Do you remember that?
No,
it's not the same thing, maybe.
It's not the same thing.
What's the difference?
There is a subtle difference, because I've looked into this a few times because I've spoken to geographers and they've told me, no, it's not the same thing. People just didn't know much about tsunamis before.
Oh, that's why that word wasn't used in the 70s and 80s.
Not in many places outside Southeast Asia, yeah. But of course, it's a Japanese word, so they've had it for a long time.
Right.
I'll tell you the difference as far as I understand as a non-specialist. I'm not a geographer or a seismic expert, but a tidal wave, that's T-I-D-A-L, tidal is the adjective which comes from the noun tide, T-I-D.
Marea.
Marea, the natural movement of the sea because of the movement of the earth and the moon and the gravitational pull and all that. That's why we have a tide.
Yeah.
I can't go into any more detail than that. I don't know, but that's more or less why tides occur. So tidal waves are when you get really, really big movement of the sea, but basically because of the moon and the earth and that gravitational pull, but just in a really exaggerated or abrupt way, you get a very large movement of tide. That's a tidal wave.
So a tsunami is when there's an earthquake under the sea.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Is the most typical explanation, but there are a few other things which can cause a tsunami as well. Usually an earthquake, but it can be when there's a land which falls into the sea, when there's landfall, into the sea or a landslide, then if it's a lot of land, it can displace. It can move out of position, the water, and that can cause a tsunami as well. And
that builds up over distance, and then it becomes huge and goes on land. That happened in Japan a few years ago.
Exactly. So they're not quite the same. But the effect will look quite similar. If you're on the coast, you'll see a lot of water coming towards you, but the causes are different.
Right. Another possible source of a natural disaster is a volcano. And the verb for when everything comes out of the volcano is to erupt.
So yes, the Spanish word is volcán. Volcano, volcán. I've always been intrigued by that because it should be the other way around. I say should. Volcano, but if I pronounced it volcano, sounds much more Spanish than volcán, if you ask me.
Yeah.
It should be that Spanish is volcano and English is volcan, but it isn't. It's English, which is volcano, and Spanish, which is volcán.
Not to be confused with Vulcan, which is Mr. Spock.
Yeah, with you, yeah. Live long and prosper, everyone.
Live long and prosper. The stuff that comes out of a volcano is called magma, which is a word I love saying. I don't know why. It's really, really nice to say the word magma. So that's the molten rock in the Earth's crust.
What do you mean by molten rock?
Molten is fluid. It flows. It moves. It's not exactly liquid, but it's not solid. So when it's very, very hot, the rock melts, funde. It melts and it moves along the ground. And it's inside the Earth's crust. It's actually inside the Earth.
What's the crust of the Earth? Crust.
Crustefa?
No, costra.
Costra, is it? La costra. And molten rock that is so hot that it's liquid, is called lava, which I think is the same in Spanish. And as I said before, it flows. The verb to flow. Liquid flows. Any other natural disasters?
Yes, there are tornadoes. Notice the pronunciation is slightly different to Spanish, but the spelling's the same. Tornadoes. That's a violent windstorm over land. Often called a twister these days because the air, the atmosphere thing seems to twist to go round and round and round and round.
And then there's whirlwind, 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 which is a column of air which is whirling or moving around itself in a circular motion, as Reza said.
Also, hurricane is a phenomenon which will involve a lot of wind.
Did you say hurricane?
Yes.
Ah, that's interesting.
You say hurricane?
Yes, I say hurricane. So which is the correct pronunciation, or are both acceptable?
I think both are acceptable. Some say hurricane, some say hurricane. And then, of course, there are typhoons, which other people say, well, it's the same as a hurricane, but it's not quite, is it, Craig?
Well, a hurricane, a cyclone, and a typhoon basically are heavy rains and winds. So there's very strong winds and a lot of rain, but there are differences, aren't there? Does it depend on the area where they happen?
For me, yes, that's the only difference I know of. When it happens in the South Pacific or Southeast Asia, they call it a typhoon.
Right.
And if it happens in the Atlantic, they call it, or the North Pacific, they call it hurricane.
Yeah, and a cyclone you can use to describe both. So if you say cyclone, it really doesn't matter where it is. Something interesting, though, a hurricane, cyclone, or typhoon in the southern hemisphere goes clockwise in the way the clock moves in that direction. But in the northern hemisphere, it's anti-clockwise or counter-clockwise in the same way the water goes down the drain, el desagüe, in the sink, for example. So hurricanes follow that law between the northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere, and I didn't know that.
Well, me neither. That is incredible.
Moving on to other disasters, there's an avalanche, very similar word in Spanish, avalanche, which is basically sliding snow. To slide is deslizar, so when the snow moves. Then there's blizzard, which is BLIZZARD, which is tormenta de nieve. And snowstorms. Of course, if there's a storm with snow, it's a snowstorm, compound noun.
At the other end of the spectrum, el espectro, you've got heat waves. So when it's very hot weather for a period of time, it's a heat wave. And if it's a very, very, very long period of dry weather, then you might have a drought. DROUGHT. That's when there's no water and the ground is very, very hard and dry and plants won't grow and animals are dying, etc.
At that time of year, particularly in Spain in the summer when there are heat waves and droughts, it's very common to see forest fires, fires that are not under control and they spread or move very quickly. Another word for a forest fire is a bush fire. Bush is arbusto in Spanish. Or you could also say wildfire, another compound noun, because it's not under control. So it's wild, salvaje, and it spreads very quickly and devastates, destroys forests and trees.
I think the word bushfire is probably most commonly used in Australia, where they talk about the bush, the area where it's very dry, but there are some trees and bushes, arbustos, so they call it the bush. It's a very common expression for Australia, where it happens a lot, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Another thing that happens a lot in Australia, bizarrely, apart from the wildfires, is flooding. So in the same continent, you get extreme heat causing fires, but they also get a lot of floods or flooding as well in Australia. There are specific types of floods. For example, a flash flood. Flash means quick. So a flash flood happens very quickly. Maybe the land is very hard and dry because it hasn't rained for a long time. And then it begins to rain extremely heavily. And the water has nowhere to go because it doesn't get absorbed into the land. That's when you get a flash flood. So a flash flood is actually common in dry countries rather than wet countries.
Yeah. And be careful of the pronunciation of the word flood. It's double O. And as in blood, the vowel sound is ah. So blood and flood. Don't confuse that with the double O in food, for example, which is oo. So there's food, flood, and blood. Be careful of that pronunciation. When it rains a lot, it's common in some parts of the world for the land to move or to slide. If you remember from before, this to slide is deslizar. So a landslide, one word, compound noun. A landslide is where the land moves. And there was a horrible disaster earlier this year in Sri Lanka where it rained a lot and the landslides killed people and covered villages.
Landslides often regularly happen in some countries as a result of monsoons, which I suppose you could call a disaster in a way, but actually it's something which happens every year. In some countries, there's a rainy season, a season where it just rains and rains and rains and rains.
For about 2 months sometimes.
And very heavily, the monsoon. And although it's a natural phenomenon, it can be disastrous for some people, and it can often cause landslides and other problems. Mind you, I like my dad's version of monsoons. He recalls it as the best time of the year when he was a child. He always loved monsoons when he was growing up in India as a child, because in those days there were no fridges. Well, not many anyway in India. And it also coincides with the arrival of mangoes.
Ah, right.
And he has these stories of nice memories when he was a kid of just waiting for the monsoon to come. Oh, brilliant, the monsoon. And people at first actually go out into the street to get soaking wet. They want it at first.
Because it refreshes them after the heat wave.
Yeah, months and months without any. And he used to go out with a bucket, as did many people, collect the rainwater in a bucket. And in the bucket, you'd put your mangoes to keep them nice and cold. Because there were no fridges. And then you just took the mango out of the bucket and ate it there in the rain. Sounds lovely, doesn't it?
It does sound wonderful. I think they showed that in Monsoon Wedding.
Yeah, did that happen?
I think so. Yeah. Good film, by the way, Monsoon Wedding. Highly recommended, but watch it, please, in English. We spoke about strong winds before. Now, when winds get very, very strong, they become gales. Gale. Any idea what gale is in Spanish?
I do, but I bet you most people listening don't because you don't know. You don't use it much. It's galerna.
I thought it was vendaval.
As well. Vendaval's another one.
Vendaval, yeah.
But you don't hear either word very often in Spanish, but they do exist.
So a gale force wind can be measured. The name of the scale that measures gale force winds is the Beaufort scale, and it goes from 0 to 12. So it measures the strength of the wind force, the Beaufort scale.
Craig, if there's a gust of wind, what does that mean? Does it mean que da gusto? No.
No.
No da gusto.
A gust of wind is a short kind of blast of wind, isn't it? It's where the wind kind of gets very, very strong and then stops. It's not constant. So it's a gust of wind. Imagine you're walking down the street with a hat and suddenly this wind comes and takes off your hat. That's a gust of wind.
Of course, one of the effects of a lot of wind can be a dust storm. Dust is polvo. Mm-hmm. Or even worse and very dangerous, a sandstorm. People have died as a result of sandstorms. If you're near the desert and the winds pick up, that means they become strong and the sand goes everywhere. It can kill you because you can't breathe. It takes all the oxygen out of the air. It gets in your lungs and everywhere. So a very dangerous situation is a sandstorm.
If you saw Tom Cruise's film Mission Impossible 2 or 3, no, 3, I think, there was a really bad sandstorm and he's running around in the desert. In Dubai, I think it was. Yeah, in Dubai, there was a horrible sandstorm and Tom Cruise is running through the desert. So if you remember that film, you know what a sandstorm is. Now, with all of these natural disasters from weather, it's quite common to have a blackout. Now, what's a blackout or a power cut? Not exactly a natural disaster, is it, Reza? But it can be caused by a natural disaster.
Yes, and it can certainly be disastrous, the adjective. So, for example, imagine there was a hurricane or a storm or a tornado or an earthquake or flooding. The power lines might fall. The posts where the electric cables are attached, they might fall. So then you're not going to get any electricity. You're going to have a blackout. And it couldn't happen at a worse time because you might be injured. You might need help from electronic equipment for medical reasons, but there's no electricity. So blackouts and natural disasters tend to go hand in hand. They tend to accompany each other.
Yeah, and we've had power cuts here in Valencia, but we haven't had any severe weather, which is strange. But sometimes for no reason, there's a power cut and you lose all of your electricity. There's one thing that's worrying to me personally, and when I investigated a little bit online and checked this, I realized that it could happen at any time. It's a solar flare. In Spanish, erupción solar. It happens every couple of hundred years. Well, they're happening all the time. But sometimes the solar flares get really, really big and they can actually affect communication systems, satellites, electricity. There was a really big one a couple of hundred years ago and it burned out telegrams. It actually set fire to telegram machines all over the world. And when you get these solar flares, they're accompanied by something called a coronal mass ejection, a CME, which can cause geomagnetic storms and cause all sorts of problems in the world, which could affect our lives and be very, very serious. Have you heard of those before, Reza?
I had heard of them, but I to be honest, I didn't really know much about them till you explained it just now.
And we're due for one within the next sort of 100 years or so. So it could happen anytime. It could happen tomorrow. It could happen 100 years from now. But when it does happen, because we're so reliant and we depend so much on the internet now and satellites, then there could be some really severe consequences.
Another problem that might emanate from space but affect us down on Earth is a meteorite impact or a meteorite strike. Un impacto, yeah, golpe. It sounds like science fiction, but it's not. They happen all the time. They're quite regular. It's just that the meteorites tend to be quite small when they reach Earth, but occasionally there are big ones which reach Earth. I think the last really big one was a couple of years ago, for 5 years ago. So in Russia, do you remember that one? It landed in the middle of a city somewhere.
And I think if they're big enough, they could actually knock the Earth out of the orbit, couldn't they?
Yeah, it's possible. And some scientists reckon that it happens every few 100,000 years or something. So who knows? It could happen one of these days.
So let me ask you, Reza, have you or would you ever volunteer to help in a disaster?
I certainly would if I could. If there was a disaster in my area and I survived, I would do everything I could to help people. But the ones I really admire are those volunteers who go abroad and travel just to help people, for purely altruistic reasons, not to earn any money or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, do you remember was it an earthquake, I think, in Nepal not long ago? And a lot of people from all over the world traveled to try and help the Nepalese, and they're still struggling to put things back to normal.
Yeah, I actually passed through Kathmandu in 2015, a couple of months after the earthquake. I wasn't there to volunteer and to help. I was traveling in the area, but I stayed there for a while, and it was devastation. It was very, very difficult to see and to experience. How can people prepare for a disaster? You can't really, because they tend to happen quite suddenly, don't they?
I suppose, although when there's earthquakes, very often straight after or not long after the earthquake, they have these aftershocks,
Mm-hmm.
which are like slightly smaller tremors, but still big, as a result of the first tremor. And because you know they might happen, you can prepare for them by staying outside of buildings, because the worst place you want to be is inside a building in an earthquake. It's better to be out in the open.
Mm-hmm.
So I suppose that's one way you could prepare for aftershocks.
And there are tsunami warnings, but I'm not sure if you really have enough time to clear the area, to get to high land, to escape the area. So there are some warnings, but it's not always enough time to do anything and to get away from the danger.
They say that, curiously, for some reason which we can't quite explain, many animals know when disasters are on the way before we do.
Yeah.
And they don't have internet or satellites or Wi-Fi or radios or anything other than their instinct. For example, dogs and birds quite often seem to know when something like a tsunami or a tidal wave is on the way, and they kind of run in the other direction, and we think they've gone crazy.
Perhaps they're more in tune with nature, and we're coming away from having that kind of relationship and feeling about nature.
Talking about nature, Craig, what about epidemics? Things like bird flu, la gripe aviar, the gripe de aves, the flu, gripe, which came from birds. Is that a natural disaster, or is it man-made, would you say?
I'm going to say that it's man-made. I think, but I'm not sure, though, because AIDS was an epidemic when it surfaced many years ago, and that wasn't man-made.
No.
But they can be, can't they?
Yep. There are disasters.
What's your opinion? When I think of epidemic, I think of diseases and that spread quickly.
Yeah, which of course is a disaster. If many people get a disease, you could classify it as a disaster. But is it natural or not? I suppose in a way, yes, unless it's some disease which has been artificially manufactured, which is rare. But there are a few. For example, anthrax.
Mm-hmm.
If there were ever an epidemic of anthrax, I hope there isn't, but that would not be natural, because anthrax is a disease which was totally manufactured in laboratories.
Yeah.
And
I think swine flu as well was a result of humans feeding animals grain and food that they shouldn't be eating. So it was a man-caused disaster.
Floods is another good one. Are they natural? Well, usually yes, but sometimes no. I'll give you an example. Compare, as an example, the sea flooding a house near the coast during a storm. There's not a lot you can do about that. That's natural. It's the sea. You can't really control the sea much. But what about a village being flooded when a dam wall breaks? A dam is una presa, a wall which is containing a river or a lake and stopping it from moving. If that breaks, that will cause a disaster. Is that natural? Not really, because humans built the wall.
Exactly. It's only there because humans built it, so it's not a natural disaster. So now it's your turn to practice your English. Do you have any comments or questions about what we've said in this episode? Or perhaps you have an idea for us for a future episode? We would love to receive your voice messages and hear what you have to say, just like Anna and Veronica did in this episode. If you want to send us a message, go to speakpipe.com/English Ingles Podcast. Or you could send us an email to me, Craig, at inglespodcast.com.
Or to me, Reza, at belfastreza@gmail.com.
And if you would like more detailed show notes, go to patreon.com/inglespodcast and join our Patreon sponsors. Let's thank our lovely sponsors who are Beatriz, Pedro, Maite, Lara, Rafa, Nestor Garcia Mañez from nestorgm.com, Maria Lorena, Sara, Carlos, Mamin, Juan, Cory Finneran from ivmv.com, Miren, Jose, Agus, Mariel, Manuel, Jorge, Raul, Rafael, Manuel. And we have some new sponsors. Welcome and thank you to Jose Manuel, Fernandez Picazo, Juan Carlos Rodado, Pilar Martinez, who lives in France but listens to us regularly. And I think we have a current sponsor who's changed her name. I noticed we have a sponsor called Ganbate Blog, which is someone who's learning Japanese. And I have a feeling it's Thara. So Thara, I think you're learning Japanese. I hope it's going well. And thank you for continuing to support us.
Craig, what do our lovely Patreon sponsors get for being sponsors?
Well, thanks to Angelica Bello, you can get all of our episodes as they are released. You can get the transcript for those. Every week we publish a new transcript, and if you're a Patreon member, you get that sent to you by email. Also, you could get a How to Pass a Job Interview MP3 and PDF ebook. So that's also available from the Patreon page. We also have free transcripts on the website, and thank you to Alberto from Granada, Angelica, of course, and Arminda from Madrid, who have been translating for us. And we have a new volunteer, Patricia from Madrid, who is translating also. She's just finished episode 9 and she also did episode 8. So thanks to all of those lovely people, we have full transcriptions for free for you on the webpage, episodes 1 to 9 and episodes 131 to 142. So thanks, Patricia, for joining the team. On next week's episode, Reza, what's the subject?
Next week, we have supermarket vocabulary.
So that's it for this week. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week. The music in this podcast is by Hits. The track is called See You Later.